In the high-stakes theater of international trade, the most dangerous move is often the one that forces your opponent to realize they don't actually need you. For decades, the economic relationship between Canada and the United States was predicated on a quiet, logistical assumption. Canada produces the raw materials, but the United States owns the path to market. It was a geography of dependency. Canadian grain, potash, and energy flowed south, riding American rails and passing through American ports to reach the world, leaving billions in transit fees in American pockets. But in early 2026, that assumption was shattered. What began as a tactical threat from the White House to impose severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer has backfired in spectacular fashion, catalyzing the resurrection of a frozen, forgotten port on the edge of the Arctic. Instead of capitulating to Washington's demands, Ottawa has quietly engaged in the most significant re-engineering of North American trade flows since the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is the story of the Port of Churchill, the $780 billion exodus, and the strategic miscalculation that pushed Canada to build an empire Washington can no longer touch. The conflict began with a familiar rhetoric. Work for farms, President Trump declared, framing a new protectionist push. A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that's the way you want to bolster here, and we can do it here. The target was specific: potash. This pink mineral salt is the lifeblood of modern agriculture, and the United States is critically dependent on it. Currently, over 95% of the potash used by American farmers is imported, and 90% of that comes from the massive underground reserves of Saskatchewan. The president's logic was transactional: threaten the trade flow to force concessions or spur domestic production. When they start charging and sending it, very high prices from other countries, we're not going to let that happen, he insisted. Washington believed it held the leverage. The threat of a 25% tariff, combined with pressure on fertilizer exports, was designed to corner the Canadian government. The assumption was that Canada, faced with a wall at the southern border, would have no choice but to negotiate on American terms. But this calculation ignored a critical reality. Canada didn't need to negotiate if it could simply leave the room. While Washington focused on tariffs, Mark Carney and the Canadian leadership were focusing on geography. The answer to the American squeeze lay 2,000 kilometers north of the U.S. border, in a tiny subarctic town on the shores of Hudson Bay, Churchill, Manitoba. For decades, Churchill was the ghost of Canadian ambition. Built in the 1930s as a northern gateway to Europe, it offered a deep-water port connected by rail to the heart of the continent. Its geographic advantage is undeniable. Shipping from Churchill cuts thousands of kilometers off the route to Europe compared to using the St. Lawrence Seaway or routing through American ports on the Gulf Coast. Yet, through neglect and lack of vision, it was allowed to rot. In a symbol of its irrelevance, the federal government sold the port and its lifeline rail track to an American company, Omnitrax, in 1997 for a single dollar. When floods washed out the tracks in 2017, the port went silent. But infrastructure creates behavior, and crisis creates opportunity. The tariff threats from the South provided the political capital and economic urgency to resurrect the Arctic Gateway. The logic was simple, as Carney articulated in a moment that shifted the national conversation. Why are we shipping Canadian fertilizer through American ports when we have our own Arctic Gateway? The pivot from rhetoric to reality arrived on March 7, 2025. Genesis Fertilizers, a farmer-owned cooperative, announced a strategic partnership with the Arctic Gateway Group. The deal was a direct repudiation of the southern trade route. Genesis unveiled plans to import 300,000 tons of phosphate annually through the Port of Churchill and to export finished fertilizer products through the same corridor. This was not just a business deal. It was a proof of concept. Genesis is planning a state-of-the-art plant capable of producing 1 million tons of fertilizer annually. By routing 300,000 tons of imports through the Arctic, they bypass American rails, American ports, and American tariffs entirely. If the Genesis model works, it breaks the psychological barrier for the rest of the industry. Saskatchewan's fertilizer sector is worth billions annually. If one company can successfully navigate the Hudson Bay route, the logic of paying American logistics fees evaporates for everyone else. Why pay a middleman who threatens you with trade wars when you can own the road yourself? The numbers behind this shift are staggering. The $780 billion figure that has shocked analysts is not a single year's loss, but the cumulative value of trade redirected over a decade of infrastructure realignment. 1. Potash and fertilizer. Saskatchewan sits on 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves, enough to feed the world for centuries. Canada controls 41% of global exports, worth $5.5 billion annually. If even half of this volume shifts to the northern corridor over the next 10 years, that is nearly $30 billion stripped from southern supply chains. 2. Grain exports. This is the heavyweight champion of the prairies. Canada exports roughly $11.5 billion in grain annually. Currently, about 27.7 million tons ship through Vancouver's congested terminals or transit through the U.S. Churchill's Port of Churchill Plus project, backed by $180 million in government commitment, aims to modernize grain handling and use icebreakers to extend the shipping season. Moving just 20% of current volumes through the Arctic diverts billions in cargo value away from U.S. transit hubs. 3. Critical minerals. The Ring of Fire in northern Ontario and deposits in Manitoba are rich in the minerals needed for the green energy transition. The natural exit route for these resources is north, not south. 4. Energy potential. While more speculative, the dream of an energy corridor for LNG exports through Churchill remains alive. If realized, it would add hundreds of billions to the ledger. When you aggregate wheat, canola, specialty crops, fertilizer, and potential mineral exports, and project a decade of growth, the total value of trade moving through Canadian-controlled infrastructure rather than American networks approaches the $700 billion to $800 billion mark. The strategic tragedy for Washington is that this shift is permanent. Infrastructure is destiny. Once a grain elevator is built, a rail line upgraded, and a supply chain contract signed, the flow of goods does not snap back simply because a president changes his mind. Trump's tariff strategy was predicated on the idea that Canada was a captive market. He believed that the lack of domestic U.S. fertilizer production gave him leverage to force Canadian compliance. He acknowledged the domestic shortfall in November, exempting Canadian potash from duties because the only other major producers, Russia, Belarus, and China, were geopolitically toxic. Yet, he returned to the threat in December, seemingly unaware that his unpredictability was the very fuel driving the Churchill expansion. By making the southern route risky, Washington made the northern route necessary. Every threat of a border tax was a marketing brochure for the Arctic Gateway. Canadian companies that had previously tolerated the higher costs of southern shipping for the sake of convenience suddenly found that convenience came with an unacceptable political risk premium. The Port of Churchill is no longer a relic. It is the cornerstone of a new economic sovereignty. The federal government's commitment of capital, new grain handling systems, expanded storage, and modern loading equipment signals to the world that Canada is open for business, independent of American permission. For European buyers, the advantages are purely mathematical. Churchill cuts roughly 6 days off the delivery time to European markets compared to Vancouver. It offers lower logistics costs, more predictable delivery schedules, and zero exposure to American trade politics. This success creates a template for other sectors. Manitoba potash producer Padcom has already signed on to the Churchill route for 2025. British Columbia's ports are reaching saturation. The Arctic offers a release valve. Alberta is eyeing the corridor. The dependency model that defined North American trade for 80 years is dissolving. History may record this moment as one of the great unforced errors in trade diplomacy. Donald Trump sought to demonstrate American strength by squeezing a friendly neighbor. Instead, he demonstrated American unreliability, forcing that neighbor to build a backdoor to the global market. The United States has lost more than just transit fees and logistics jobs. It has lost the invisible leverage that comes from being the only road in town. Canada isn't violating trade agreements. It isn't closing its markets to American goods. It is simply doing what sovereign nations do, investing in its own infrastructure to secure its own future. Mark Carney asked the question that changed everything. Why are we shipping through American ports? The answer, provided by the White House itself, was that they could no longer be trusted. And so, the ships are turning north, the rails are humming in Manitoba, and $780 billion in trade is sailing away from American shores, likely never to return. The Arctic Gateway is open, and for Washington, it is a cold, hard reality check. Economic impact. The diversion of logistics fees affects U.S. rail operators, like BNSF and Union Pacific, and ports, New Orleans, Houston, Portland. Political irony. The America First policy incentivized Canada First infrastructure. Long term, the development of Churchill strengthens Canada's claim to Arctic sovereignty and opens direct trade lanes to Europe and Asia that bypass U.S. control entirely.